I'm Maitreyi Sitharaman. Welcome to a new season of Real Economy, where this week, considering the focus all summer on Greece and its debt, we're asking how much government debt is really good, and do we really understand what sustainable and unsustainable debt is? On the show, we'll take a trip to Portugal to see what the country is doing about its high debt levels. We'll also take a look at how a small country like Latvia managed to turn things around. We'll then rope in Soni Kapoor, Managing Director of think tank Redefine, to talk about all the various debates swirling around the very concept of debt sustainability. We know our governments need debt in order to fill the shortfall in their income from taxes and printing money to run a country. If Christoph had to raise debt, it would be based on the valuation of his business and how he intended to spend the money in order to increase revenues. But countries cannot be valued, and their expenditure, like paying for essential services, doesn't always lead to economic returns. So how do governments keep a tab on whether their debt is sustainable or not? Let's find out.
Your government sells bonds on which they pay interest to the domestic and foreign investors who buy them back after a fixed number of years. Say your government has debts that equal 20% of GDP. If this year they pay all the interest due to the investors, the next year the debt level versus GDP falls. That's because GDP, a measure of a country's growth, almost always rises. To ensure the debt is sustainable, i.e. governments have the ability to pay it back in the future, your economy must grow, and only what is needed must be borrowed when that growth happens. If your country's GDP doesn't rise, debt levels start to go up. Investors worried about your government's ability to pay them may hike interest rates on bonds to cover the risk of your government defaulting. That raises the cost of borrowing for governments that continue to borrow in an economic slowdown. If the proportion of debt versus GDP rises too much and your country's ability to grow is under question, the debt becomes unsustainable.
Now, think of Greece's debt like this melon compared to other economies in Europe. It's big and getting bigger. That's because they kept borrowing money even as the economy slowed down. Interest rates went up and they kept borrowing more money to pay off the old debt. Most of that payment went to foreign investors, so straight out of the country. Many countries in Europe are in a similar pickle. Portugal, for example, has a debt that would be a pineapple versus a melon. So Monica Pinner took a road trip through Portugal to find out if they're doing enough to convince investors they are serious about making their debt sustainable.
7 a.m. on the road from the Portuguese town of Covilhã to Coimbra. This long stretch of motorway is always almost deserted. Like many others where tolls were introduced as part of a €78 billion bailout deal. While Portugal exited the recovery programme in 2014, transport companies are still paying the price.
We avoid the highway because toll charges are too high. We take the highway for 15 kilometers, then we enter the national road for 40 kilometers, and then again we take the highway.
No Nacional a volta de 40 quilómetros. Depois saímos outra vez na autoestrada.
Antonio's company is among many Portuguese businesses that had to face the consequences of reforms and adapt. He cut his staff from 55 to 40 after the toll charges were implemented. The additional costs also forced him to open a new depot near Coimbra and to reduce the number of vehicles.
Our company paid €30,000 in toll charges in 2014, and we've tried to use alternatives when possible. If we had to use only highways, we would pay around €60,000, and that's unsustainable.
In 2011, Portuguese public debt was around 111% of GDP. Today, it's reached 130%, over twice the limit of the 60% cited by the EU as sustainable. Nevertheless, something has changed. It's about market perception.
A simple look at the figures tells Antonio that the steep price his business is paying isn't helping reduce his country's debt. Nevertheless, investors think that the efforts are indicative of Portugal's determination to make itself sustainable. But Portugal needs more, say some. What's needed now is a revision of Euro rules.
The Economic and Monetary Union put many different things in the same bucket. Potatoes and green beans, whose structures are very different. If we put them together, they can damage each other. But we can put these things together. Potatoes with tomatoes, for example. To do it, we have to protect them. We have to put each in the right place.
Most economists also think Portugal will need clear structural reforms in education, employment, industrial output, investment, and the redistribution of gains.
Joining us is Sonny Kapoor. He is the managing director of think tank Redefine. He's an economist and a prolific speaker on everything to do with the European economy. Sonny, let me start by using the example of Portugal and, say, Greece. How did they get to the position they are in now, and how can they turn things around?
They're essentially developing economies that are stuck in the developed world. That has meant that the way that they have managed to keep up with the rest of Europe is essentially by living on borrowed money. But when the crisis hit, it was like the tide going out, and suddenly you can see who's swimming naked. And so people started questioning their sustainability, and that generated this self-fulfilling downward spiral of the kind you see when a cartoon character walks off the cliff. For a while, nothing bad happened, and then suddenly they realize that there's nothing but thin air, and they start falling down.
So how does the cartoon character start floating back up again?
There is nothing particularly in the short term. It means Portugal, for example, they need to ramp up their education system, but that takes time. Greece doesn't really have a proper manufacturing base. The money, traditionally through governments, to make these investments has suddenly dried up. So we're caught in this quandary where the short-term answer is, hey, we have to live within one's means. But that's not an answer a country can have, because that simply means that the country becomes poorer and poorer and poorer. The question is not whether they need to borrow or not, but how much they borrow and how the money is actually used.
Sonny, I want us to take a pause for a second and take a trip with Monica Pinner to the small economy of Latvia, which managed to turn things around.
In 2008, Latvia's economy began to nosedive, with public debt rising and GDP falling. The crisis shook the country, and it asked for a bailout in 2009, which it exited in 2012. After tough times, a few businesses like this cosmetics company have emerged smelling of roses.
Focusing on exports and also, of course, not forgetting about our domestic market has helped us to, guide the company through almost 10 years of existence, and also through the crisis.
That export focus was echoed by many, helping Latvia become one of the fastest growing economies in the EU. And it even managed to avoid devaluing its currency, enabling it to join the Eurozone in 2014.
Economists use Latvia's case as an example to policymakers trying to deal with troubled economies within the Eurozone.
Debt soared to almost half of GDP in 2010. It declined slowly at first, but is expected to fall ever more quickly into next year. So how did Latvia do the impossible? How did it turn this situation around?
It's a combination of the reforms in all three areas, in the fiscal, in the financial sector, and also in a lot of structural reforms in a lot of areas, like a labor market, like export. In 2009, it was the first year when the program started. We did a consolidation around the 8.8% of the GDP, and the main consolidations was made not on the revenue side, but on the expenditure side.
Can this elixir for healthier debt levels work on other EU economies? Latvia's small size leads many critics to question whether the makeover that gave its economy a new look will work for larger models.
Still with us is Sonny Kapoor. Sonny, is the Latvia story replicable across Europe, considering how small an economy it is?
For a number of reasons, no. One is, as you yourself mentioned, the small size of the economy. The second is most of their prosperity is very recent. And so you are far more resilient in terms of the downside of how much you're willing to lose if you know that you've only just gained all of it in the past 10 years or so, than the older Western European economies such as Greece, where the prosperity has been longer term, where the expectations are higher.
So do we change the way we look at debt sustainability?
Borrowing in itself is neither good or bad. It depends on what the money is used for. So a concept that's currently becoming fashionable is unproductive versus productive borrowing. Is it sensible, for example, as an individual, to borrow to go to MIT or go to Harvard University? The answer, in most cases, is absolutely yes. You get a positive return on investment. Similarly, for a country, is it sensible to borrow to invest in an education system that helps produce productive workers? Is it sensible to invest in infrastructure that will help an economy take off? It sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes borrowing more is actually the best way of reducing your future debt or improving your debt sustainability.
So how do you measure the risks?
If you plan ahead, if you know that you have a number of different sources you can borrow from, if you borrow for a long term, and this was a big advantage that we had in the UK, borrowing to invest in productive debt and having a contingent plan in case of an emergency, because they always arise, having this living will, having this plan will be very, very constructive in managing future potential crisis and market disturbances. As we can improve the efficiency of the public sector, we can borrow, invest in improving productivity in education at present low borrowing rates, and boost growth potential. That is by far the best approach, rather than focusing in a very, very narrow way on just repaying borrowing. That is short-sighted.